I'm Alan Mortis, and this is Think Radio Presents Think Planet. My guest today is anthropologist Mark Stiger.
Well, what's up there is extensive archaeological remains from people who lived in the past in the Gunnison area that is somewhat surprising. The age of the remains goes back to at least 10,400 years ago. Many archaeologists didn't think that the mountains were occupied that early.
Welcome to another great conversation on Think Radio.
Think Planet is made possible by support from the Western Colorado University School of Environment and Sustainability, empowering future change agents to foster ecologically resilient, economically sustainable, and socially just communities throughout the world.
If you like Think Planet, then I know you'll enjoy the other shows in the Think Radio Presents family of podcasts. Think People, a celebration of just how amazing people can be. Think Business, a weekly discussion with entrepreneurs, innovators, and disruptors on sustainable business into the 21st century. Subscribe to Think Radio Presents on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you get great content. And don't forget to help us spread the word by liking our social media channels and sharing the content we post. We're grateful to have you in the conversation on Think Radio Presents. My guest today is anthropologist Mark Stiger. He has a PhD from the University of New Mexico, and he specializes in hunter-gatherer archaeology in the desert and Mountain West. He served as professor of anthropology at Western Colorado University for almost 30 years now. And he's also the lead researcher at an archeological dig in central Colorado that has drawn wide attention in the scientific community. Located on top of a really rather unremarkable little mesa called Tenderfoot Mountain, the site has yielded artifacts of very surprising origin and age, essentially rewriting conventional wisdom on a number of fronts. His work was recently featured in a documentary film called Mountain Folsom, a title which, if you know anything at all about anthropology, sort of gives away the nature of Dr. Stiger's findings. Mark, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
You know, people listening on the radio or the podcast can't really see this, but we're meeting today on a pretty snowy day outside, and it occurred to me when I was preparing for your arrival that it's probably a good thing that the snow falls at least part of the year, because I don't know how you would get a rest otherwise. The snow forces you down off of the mountain, and you actually get to do something else for a change, because you spent a lot of time up there.
Yes.
What is it? Let's just go straight for the jugular here. What is up there that is so interesting and has made such a splash?
Well, what's up there is extensive archaeological remains from people who lived in the past in the Gunnison area that is somewhat surprising. The age of the remains goes back to at least 10,400 years ago, which is very, very old. Somewhat surprising. Many archaeologists didn't think that the mountains were occupied that early. In fact, for many years it was thought that the mountains were too cold, too snowy for people to spend winters here.
Well, let's stop for a second and put that number, 10,000 years, into a little bit of perspective. Because to the average person, there's nothing to compare that to. Fill in those blanks.
To compare it to perhaps better known archaeological material, the Mesa Verde ruins. Mesa Verde first gets occupied about AD 600, which is 1,400 years ago, 1,400 years ago. The pyramids were built about 4,500 years ago. And we're looking at stuff that is twice the age of the pyramids.
And how do you know that?
Radiocarbon dating, where we've got very accurate dating up there. We're able to actually date the collagen in bones that were the animals that the people hunted and killed. They left some of the bones up there. We're able to process this and actually do very accurate radiocarbon dating on the bone. We actually have a series of dates that tell us that the houses up there that we excavated a couple of years ago up there were actually occupied 10,400 years ago, with an error of about 15 years, plus or minus, which is very, very accurate.
That's remarkable. Well, so there are a lot of other things up there that make it interesting, but let's stick with age for a minute.
Sure.
First of all, I'm curious to know the moment when those lab results came back and you looked at that and saw 10,400 years, what went through your mind?
Well, we thought it was that old when we first started working up there. We found some very distinctive projectile points, and there are 15 or 20 sites with those kinds of projectile points, those Folsom points on them, and they've been dated to between 10,200 and 10,900 years ago. And so that's what we expected the dates to come back. However, the first set of dates we ran was on charcoal, and they came back only 4,000, 5,000 years ago, which
didn't really add up.
It didn't add up, but they were good radiocarbon dates. So we had a bit of a puzzle there. If they did date that recent, that would be news too. That would show that perhaps Folsom hung on in the mountains of Colorado for thousands of years, which seems kind of very strange and unbelievable. But that's what the data were telling us. When we finally were able to date the bone, we realized that the charcoal comes from other fires that have burned up there. We've got trees that grow up there. Fires will burn naturally. The charcoal blows around, gets integrated in the soil, and that's what we were dating was later material, later charcoal. So we got that little mess out, that little problem in dating, and we're able to work that to the point where now we're getting the dates we expected, and there's no doubt.
Well, was it surprising to you to find Folsom material up there at all? No matter
yes.
What its date?
Yes.
And what did that mean? Well, okay, so let's take a little aside. Explain to us why this word Folsom has such meaning in this context.
Okay, we can go back into history to the earlier part of the 20th century, and at that point there was debate. How long had people been in North America? When did Native Americans show up? There were two schools of thought. One was that people had only been here for maybe couple thousand years. This was actually the hypothesis or the idea that was backed by the federal government, because they were reservationizing people. They were they were taking the reservations and breaking them apart to individual landholders, and you could do that if people had only been there slightly longer than you had.
So it was an expedient way to look at it.
Exactly. The other school of thought was people had been here for thousands and thousands of years, perhaps even back to the last ice age. The Folsom site was the very first site that was discovered in 1927 to have human remains or human artifacts in definite association with animals that died out during the last ice age. So it showed that people had been here in North America that long ago. So it sort of settled the problem.
And the ice age being 15,000 years, something like that?
Yep. Mm-hmm. 15,000 to right about Folsom. I mean, it ends right in there. Mm-hmm. So it was important for that, settled that controversy. And it also put American archaeology on the same level or the same age as some European archaeology. It pushed it back very, very far. You know, there were all sorts of other ideas. There were hundreds of languages in North America when Europeans first contacted them. For that many languages to develop, it must have taken a long time.
Right.
So the Folsom site really gave us information that answered or supported a lot of other different kinds of questions. The first one was discovered near Folsom, New Mexico. That's why it's named Folsom, which is right on the edge of the plains. Other Folsom sites were then found in other plains locations. Of course, 1930s, the Dust Bowl era, you have lots of sediment going up in the air, which exposes artifacts laying on the ground. People find those out on the plains. Everybody thinks that's where the Folsom is centered. And in fact, most folks think, or used to think, that Folsom never came up into the mountains. I've actually seen an article which suggested that the one Folsom point that was found many years ago near Crested Butte was picked up by somebody on the plains, carried recently to Crested Butte and dropped up there. I mean, there's all sorts of insulation, to keep that one theory that that's a plains culture alive.
And this is just because no Folsom had really been found elsewhere, right? Or was there some other bias at work?
It was mainly found on the plains. And again, most people thought of the mountains as being this cold and inhospitable place. Why would anybody be up here when you could be in places like Denver, Phoenix? And
if you had the option, you would not choose to be here in the winter.
And in actuality, when you really start to dissect the environment here, there's lots of reasons to be here. The cold, the snow, that's probably one of the draws to bringing people in here.
Well, explain that. How do you get to that conclusion?
We have lots of large animals here in the Gunnison Basin. We're encircled by mountains. In the winter, the high country fills up with snow and basically locks them in. And as the snow
brings them down.
Exactly. And as the snow continues to accumulate, they're brought down. All we got to do is remember 2 winters ago, when all along the highways there were herds of elk.
Yeah, hundreds of
elk. And they can't go very far. They're hemmed in by the deep snow, which means hunters can go down and take what they need. And because it's so cold, you can freeze the meat, and it stays frozen. I grew up in Littleton, Colorado, and just south of Denver. And I think I've been colder there than any place on earth growing up. You get wet, and the wind blows, it's nasty cold.
That's true.
And then in January, it may warm up to 50, 60 degrees.
And then you're living in mud.
And your meat melts. Your frozen meat melts. Here, things stay frozen.
And another thing I've noticed, and tell me if I'm right about this, at the top of Tenderfoot, which is, about 8,800 feet, something like that?
8,600 feet.
Yeah. There are microclimates that exist. So in other words, it can be a lot colder on the valley floor, just 1,000 feet below, than it is on top of that mountain.
It can be 10, 15 degrees warmer, just 20 feet higher than the river. I actually live on the river, and my front yard is a river bank. And I've put temperature sensors there, recording temperature sensors right at the water at my house, which is about 20, 30 feet higher than the river, and then a cliff above my house. And it's cold, incredibly cold down at the river. And then at my house, 5, 10 degrees warmer, and up on a little bit higher, even warmer still.
Well, and so ancient peoples would have figured that out.
Yeah. Our founding fathers of Gunnison put the town in probably the absolute coldest place for winter.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that so much. Yeah. Well, okay. The prevailing wisdom was that while Folsom artifacts found on the plains settled one mystery, how long had people been here? No, it wasn't 1,500 years. It kind of opened up this other mystery of what sort of people were they? Did they strictly inhabit the plains, or did they range wider? Your finding, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, was really essentially the first time that an archaeological dig was able to wade into that question authoritatively.
It's certainly the best information we have for where Folsom people at 10,000 years ago, over 10,000 years ago, spent the winter. What did they do other than hunt bison. It opened up a lot of other avenues of research. Most of the virtually all the sites out on the plains are kill sites where they killed some animals and left behind the carcasses, took the meat, left the carcasses, some of their broken tools.
Right.
What we have here are houses, and multiple houses, people living here for not just a week or so while they butcher animals they killed, but this is where they spent the winter. This is where they brought stuff back to. This is where the kids lived. This is where, not just the hunters, but the eaters, the consumers lived.
And what are you finding that leads you to that conclusion?
Well, these structures are relatively large, very substantial. They're really, if they're moving around a lot, constantly on the move every few weeks, maybe they don't anticipate where they're going to be exactly. They're not going to build a rather substantial house with large rocks, upright poles, thatching, and mud, plaster. They're there for a longer period of time. Many more activities. On a kill site out on the plains, you'll find the broken projectile points that they use to spear the animals and maybe a few butchering tools. We've got 100 projectile points, 1,000 different kinds of scrapers and 1,000 butchering tool. It's just amazing.
And evidence that they're manufacturing these things up there.
Yes. There's actually a structure up there that appears not to be lived in by families, but instead it's sort of a community structure where people go to make stone tools. And in that one structure, it's about 6 meters in diameter, dug down into the ground, pit structure, we've got 35,000 pieces of flint or chert and quartzite that they were flaking to make their stone tools. An enormous amount of debris from stone tool manufacture. We have every step in the manufacturing of their projectile points because they wouldn't be successful at manufacturing every one, but they broke some. And they broke them at different places in this long set of steps of manufacturing these points. So we have some that were broken at step 1, some broken at step 2. And so we can actually piece together the entire manufacturing sequence. Really fantastic. We have bones with which are probably the longer leg bones of bison in some of these houses that have been hit with a small hammer stone, a little cobble that's used as a hammer to break open the bone to get the marrow. And there'll be splinters from the marrow bones. There'll be the little disc that's knocked out when they break open a marrow bone, and then the hammer stones. And they'll all be just in a little pile on the floor next to the inside hearth. It's material it's amazing. It reminds me very much of digging a Pueblo site or a basket maker site down around Mesa Verde.
Except that you know that it's 8,500 years older.
Exactly. It's much older and up in the mountains at 8,600 feet.
Yeah. So we've established that the fact that Folsom are there at all is really interesting.
Yes.
And that's conclusive. They're there.
Yeah.
The fact that they're there when they're there is very interesting. Was there anything else about this site that challenged sort of cherished ideas within the anthropological and archaeological communities?
The work in the mountains, archaeological work in the mountains of Colorado, just about every time we do something, we find things that we're surprised at. It's really quite wonderful not really knowing what you're doing or not knowing everything. And constantly being told by the data that, wow, there's more to learn. There's a lot more to learn.
Well, that's just the nature of science, right?
Yeah, that's the reason why we're scientists.
Yeah. Well, what's an example up there of something that kind of made everybody go, huh? What?
Well, we have another little village up there that's actually later than the Folsom material. It's hundreds of meters away from the Folsom little village. And it has a different style of projectile point, but there's some things in the manufacturing sequence that look like it came right out of Folsom. And this particular little village, they too were hunting bison. It looks like they too were up there in the winter, but they're 5,000 years later. And yet there's a number of things in their technology, in their culture, that appears very similar to what the Folsom people were doing so much earlier. And
What do you make of that?
I don't know whether that's maybe something environmental, whether it's that they just happen to be doing some of the same strategies for hunting and gathering in the winter of the mountains. Both those two time periods, the Folsom and this later period, happen to be during brief mini glacial periods. The Folsom period is 10,200 to 10,900. That's 700 years of intense cold and dry weather.
And you can see this by looking at
We can look at pollen.
paleoclimatology.
Exactly. And then right at 5,000 years ago, there's another called the neoglacial period, and it lasts for a few hundred years, and it seems like from long period of warming, all of a sudden you go back into a glacial period. And I think maybe they're picking up some of the same, or coming to some of the same solutions to problems that had been figured out earlier. Not necessarily any intellectual connection or biological connection, but a cultural connection.
Yeah, and one driven by a climate reality.
Exactly.
That's kind of there. It strikes me that there's so many dimensions to this kind of work. You can't just pick up an artifact and interpret it without looking at all kinds of different things. That's what makes your work so interesting, I think.
Well, that's anthropology.
Yeah.
It stresses holism in study of humans.
Yeah.
And we try to look at everything and how it's obviously culture is a system, and all the different parts of a culture are related. It's like an automobile. You can't really study just one piece without how does it fit into the whole rest.
Right. Take it out and the thing falls apart.
Exactly.
Are you finding anything at this site or others in Colorado that shed light on the stories that these people were telling themselves, the spirituality, their religion? Any clues to that sort of insight?
Boy, that's a good question. I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Yeah, it's perfectly fine to say, no, not really, not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah. Well, that's a long lens to be looking for things that fine.
And you also have to remember that we've just really discovered this sort of new aspect, and there's so much more to learn, so much more to do. We're at the very beginning of these kinds of some of these studies in this region. You look in the American Southwest where people have been working, archaeologists have been working for 150 years. They are still coming up with new ideas and new things that they had never even thought of. So, I look forward to other archaeologists coming into the area and discovering new stuff.
And you've only just scratched the surface at Tenderfoot, right?
That's right. Yep.
You've got enough stuff to do for years and years to come.
There's another 3 or 4 lifetimes of work up there.
Wow.
Yeah,
So here's a question that I often ask a lot of different guests. You're immersed in the world of anthropology. You understand it. You speak its language. Most people don't. If I'm just living my life, trying to make the mortgage, get the kids to school, what makes this interesting to me? Why does it matter to the average person? What does it mean to the human story that you're discovering these things?
Well, this is the human story. And we all, by virtue of the fact that we're all human, it is our story. It is the story of this region, this valley, which by virtue of us being here, we are part of that story. So it is talking about ourselves.
Yeah. Well, it certainly has made a difference to me. I can't look at Tenderfoot Mountain now and think of it without imagining stone houses up there 10,000 years ago. That just enriches the experience of the place and our connection to it.
I'm glad you think so.
Yeah, no, I do. And I appreciate the fact that you're up there with your students in the heat and the sun and the dust all summer long.
Having about as much fun as you can have.
Okay, we're going to leave that laying on the table for a minute. But it leads to my next question. Why did you get into this business to begin with? What was it about archaeology and anthropology that made you say, oh, this is it?
I don't know. I've always wanted to be an archaeologist. I actually have some written stuff from when I was 4 years old that's talked about archaeology. Were
you looking at picture books of the pyramids or something?
Oh, yeah.
And
How and Why Wonder Books of Ancient Man and all those different things. Love that stuff.
so you never wavered. You just went straight from there to...
Yeah.
Wow. Did you develop an interest in hunter-gatherer archaeology right from the get-go, or was that something that you had to sort of come to?
I always was very interested in this really early material, this Paleo-Indian stuff. In fact, I actually wrote a short story when I was in high school about an archaeologist who discovered, I think it was the first Folsom burial or some silly thing, a kid would be excited about.
Mummies and tombs.
Yeah, and he was in a small college somewhere. Anyway, it was. I've always really thought this early material was so fascinating. That's really what I wanted to do. But when I got to college, I went to CU Boulder for my undergraduate work. Most of the field work being done by archaeologists was down around Mesa Verde, and so I spent my first 5 field seasons at Mesa Verde digging up those kinds of ruins, which actually prepared me for digging houses in the mountains of Colorado. I figured out how. They showed us how to dig these kinds of pit structures when I was an undergraduate. We dug them, and they were. You had to think when you were digging them. It wasn't like a stone house where you find the floor, which is stone. You can't dig through stone. Go to a wall and turn left, and then you're inside the structure.
Yeah.
So these are rather. They're much more difficult to find. They have dirt walls, and you have to feel the different composition of the sediment. You look for little teeny tiny clues, like little tiny flakes or chunks of charcoal that are tiny, and so you have to dig. And I always think of it as much more thinking about what you're digging.
Well, the word that comes to my mind, based on things that I've heard you say to your students from time to time, is there's almost a mysticism to it. You've told them you have to listen to the archaeology and what it's telling you. And that's a level of attentiveness that goes beyond science, in my opinion. There's something else. What's that X factor that you're trying to get your students to see when you tell them that?
And I think that's actually the epitome of science, is that you have to listen. If you're going in to just demonstrate something, some idea that you have, that your idea is fact, that's much different than going in to hear if the data is going to support. The data says your fact is right. So I think there is so much wonder in the world, and just walking across campus and you look at trees and leaves and you think of the microscopic actions of chemicals within those leaves doing photosynthesis. I mean, that's pretty spectacular, and it's all around us.
Yeah.
And if you notice that, then you're just going to walk around totally amazed constantly.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with archaeology or whatever.
Yeah.
You just have to see it in action everywhere you look.
And so by listening, it's possible that another word that could be substituted there is be curious.
Yeah.
Have curiosity
Yeah.
about everything you see and be honest about what it's telling you.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time, but I do want to point out the remarkable coincidence that this site is within half an hour of the university, within half an hour of your desk, half an hour of your home. Do you sometimes pinch yourself and think, because you could be traveling. You could be having to raise money to travel. You could be living in a tent for 5 months out of the year. But you're not. You sleep in your own bed every night and go up and dig cutting edge, paradigm shifting archaeology. What's that like? I'm
the luckiest archaeologist around. It's an honor. It's sometimes I get up there and I just can't believe that I have this chance. 100 years from now, people are going to think, old Stiger, how could somebody be confronted with such an opportunity and do so little? Because
you had me until you said do so little, because
in 100 years they're going to know so much more. They're going to think that I was just wasting my time.
Okay, well, we'll let them decide. I'm not sure that that's the conclusion they're going to reach. Mark, thanks for your time today. Great conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Join us next week for another great conversation on Think Radio Presents Think Planet.